His smile promised safety. His words whispered love. By the time I realized I'd invited a predator into my home, he'd already taken everything: my savings, my dignity, my future. One swipe on an app. One lonely night. One decision that cost me $200,000 and nearly destroyed me. He wasn't a stranger. He was a weapon. And I handed him the ammunition. This is how I survived. Barbara Mitchell stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of her South End condo, watching Charlotte's skyline turn amber in the October sunset. At 57, she'd built everything she had: the mortgage paid off early, the corner office at the regional bank downtown, the carefully curated furniture that filled 3,000 square feet of solitude. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman who looked younger than her years. Auburn hair touched with gray she'd learned to embrace. Laugh lines that hadn't seen much use lately. The divorce had been final for 3 years. Richard had remarried within 6 months, someone from his gym, 20 years younger, all yoga pants and green smoothies. The kids called every Sunday like clockwork, their voices bright with news of grandchildren. Barbara saw twice a year if she was lucky. Maya was in Seattle. Connor had settled in Austin. Both had offered, half-heartedly, for her to move closer. Both had seemed relieved when she'd declined. Charlotte felt like a city of strangers now, even after 28 years. The banking conferences, the charity galas, the neighborhood wine tastings, all populated by couples who smiled with pity when they asked if she was seeing anyone. She'd stopped attending most of them. Her phone buzzed on the granite counter. Another notification from the dating app. Her daughter had insisted she download. Mom, you can't just sit in that condo forever. You're not even 60. Dad moved on. You should too. Barbara had resisted for months before finally creating a profile one sleepless night in August. Choosing photos, Maya said, were too professional, and writing a bio that felt like a resume. The messages had been depressing men her age, posting shirtless fishing photos and looking for no drama. Younger men with transparent intentions, married men claiming they were separated. She was about to delete the app when the message appeared. I noticed you mentioned loving live jazz. Have you been to the Evening Muse? There's something beautiful about music that tells a story without words. The profile showed a man named Marcus Webb, 53, works in consulting, divorced, one grown daughter. His photos showed salt and pepper hair, warm brown eyes, a genuine smile. Not trying too hard? The bio was brief but articulate. Former military, current wanderer, eternal optimist. Looking for someone who values depth over distance. Barbara's fingers hesitated over the keyboard. She could delete this too. Go back to her routines: the morning, runs around Freedom Park, the perfectly brewed coffee, the silence that had become almost comfortable in its familiarity. Instead, she typed, I haven't been in years. Would love to go again. His response came within minutes. They messaged for 2 weeks before he suggested meeting for coffee at a place in Plaza Midwood. Barbara changed her outfit 3 times that Saturday morning, finally settling on dark jeans and a cashmere sweater. Casual but put. She arrived early, ordered a latte, and watched the door. Marcus was 10 minutes late, apologetic, explaining that he'd gotten turned around on the one-way streets. In person, he was slightly shorter than his photo suggested, but his handshake was firm, his smile reaching his eyes. He ordered black coffee and a scone he didn't touch, asking questions about her work, her children, her life in Charlotte. He really listened, adding at the right moments, asking follow-up questions that showed he was paying attention. 28 years at the same bank, he said, shaking his head with admiration. That's rare these days. You must have incredible discipline. Barbara found herself talking more than she had in months, the words flowing easier with each passing minute. He told her about his time in the Army logistics, nothing dramatic, and how he'd struggled to find his footing after discharge. His divorce had been messy, he admitted. His ex-wife had gotten a house in Raleigh. He was renting a furnished apartment, month to month, while he figured out his next. I'm still trying to find where I fit, he said, his voice carrying a vulnerability that felt genuine. At our age, starting over is harder than they tell you. They talked for 3 hours. When they finally left, the autumn sun was warm on their faces, and Marcus walked her to her car. I'd really like to see you again, he said. If you're open to it. Barbara surprised herself by saying yes, immediately. Over the next month, they fell into an easy rhythm. Dinner at Upstream, where he insisted on paying despite her protests. A Saturday afternoon, browsing the used bookstores on Central Avenue, where he bought her a first edition of a Pat Conroy novel she'd mentioned loving. A Sunday morning hike at Crowder's Mountain, where the October leaves blazed orange and gold, and he held her hand on the steeper sections. He was attentive, without being suffocating, thoughtful, without being performative. He remembered small details: that she liked her wine dry, that she was allergic to shellfish, that she missed having someone to cook for. He texted good morning and good night, but never demanded constant attention. He talked about his struggles with money, his difficulty finding steady consulting work, but he never asked her for anything. By Thanksgiving, when both her kids made excuses about why they couldn't visit, Marcus was the one who showed up at her door with ingredients for a meal they cooked together. He told stories about disastrous Army mess hall dinners that made her laugh until her sides hurt. When she cried later, missing the sounds of children in the house, he held her without trying to fix anything. "You don't have to be strong all the time," he whispered. "Not with me." It was the first time in 3 years that Barbara hadn't felt completely alone. That was when she made the decision that would change everything. When his lease ended in December, and he mentioned having to find something cheaper, something further from the city, she heard herself offer before she could think it through. "You could stay here. Just temporarily. Until you get on your feet." The words hung in the air between them. Marcus's eyes widened. "Barbara, I couldn't ask you to do that." "You didn't ask. I'm offering." He moved in 2 weeks before Christmas, carrying 3 suitcases and a duffel bag, everything he owned, he said. Barbara told herself it was temporary. A few months, at most. He'd find work. He'd save money. He'd move on. She didn't notice, not yet, how the door she'd opened couldn't be closed quite so easily. The first 3 months felt like playing house. Marcus made coffee in the mornings before Barbara left for work, leaving little notes by the pot. "Have a beautiful day, or so grateful for you." He grocery shopped and cooked elaborate dinners that filled the condo with warmth and the smells Barbara had missed since her marriage ended. He was affectionate, pulling her into slow dances in the kitchen, complimenting her constantly. The loneliness that had pressed against her chest for years finally lifted. Her friends noticed the change. Linda from book club raised an eyebrow when Barbara mentioned Marcus had moved in. "That's fast, isn't it? You barely know him?" "We're both adults," Barbara said, defensive. "It's practical. He's between places." But privately, she wondered if Linda was right. There were small things that bothered her: how he'd rearrange her kitchen cabinets without asking, insisting his system was more efficient. How he'd go quiet for days when his job applications came back with rejections, retreating into himself until Barbara coaxed him out with reassurance and comfort. How he'd started making comments about her work clothes. That skirt's a little short for the office, don't you think? You don't want to give guys the wrong idea. By March, the financial questions began. They were sitting at the kitchen island one evening, Barbara going through bills on her laptop, when Marcus leaned over her shoulder. You pay that much for car insurance? I know a guy who could cut that in half. It's comprehensive coverage, Barbara explained, not looking up. I've had the same agent for 15 years. Exactly, my point. His voice had an edge. Now, you're too loyal. Companies count on that. They overcharge people who don't push back. The conversation shifted to her investment accounts, her retirement planning, her outdated approach to money. Marcus had opinions about everything. She should be more aggressive with her portfolio. She was being too conservative. She was letting opportunities pass. He offered to look over her finances, to help her optimize. Barbara declined, gently. But something had shifted. He withdrew that night, cold and distant, until she apologized for not valuing his input. In April, his car broke down. A timing belt, he said, would cost $2,000 to fix. He was still between consulting gigs, still waiting for the big contract he kept promising was just around the corner. Barbara found herself offering to cover the repair. Just this once. You can pay me back when you land something. He kissed her forehead, gratitude pouring from him. You're saving my life. I don't know what I'd do without you. The repairs took 3 weeks and cost $3,000. Barbara paid without questioning the inflated estimate. Then his daughter, the one from his marriage, needed money for medical bills. Then his credit card payment bounced, and he needed a short-term loan to avoid late fees. Then, each request came wrapped in a story. A crisis, a promise to repay. Each time Barbara hesitated, Marcus grew cold, accusing her of not trusting him, of treating him like a charity case rather than a partner. I thought we were building something together, he'd say, his voice wounded. But you're keeping score, like I'm some kind of burden. Barbara would apologize, terrified of losing the only person who made her feel less alone. She'd transfer the money. He'd be loving again. The cycle repeated. By summer, she'd lent him $18,000. None of it had been repaid. Her daughter called in late June, asking if Barbara could help with a down payment on a new house in Seattle. Maya and her husband had been saving, but they were just short. Barbara opened her savings account and stared at the number that had been steadily depleting. I can't right now, honey, she said, the words bitter in her mouth. Things are tight? There was silence on the other end. Mom, you're a VP at a bank. How can things be tight? Barbara ended the call quickly, citing a meeting. She sat in her office with the door closed, fighting tears. That evening, Marcus suggested they combine finances. We're basically married at this point, he said, his arm around her shoulders, as they sat on the couch. Separate accounts just create distance. Don't you trust me? Of course, I trust you, Barbara said automatically. But her stomach twisted. Then, let's simplify. I'll handle all the bills, the budgeting. You're stressed with work. Let me take something off your plate. She said she'd think about it. That night, she barely slept, staring at the ceiling while Marcus snored beside her. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. But when she tried to name it, to pin down what exactly was happening, the thought slipped away like smoke. In the morning, Marcus was cold again. He didn't make coffee. He barely spoke. "Are you okay?" Barbara asked. "I'm fine," clipped, dismissive. "Marcus, talk to me." He turned to her, eyes hard. "It's just clear you don't see me as an equal. You want to keep control. It's your house, your money, your decisions. I'm just living in your shadow." "That's not fair," Barbara protested, panic rising. "I've given you everything." "Exactly. Given. Like I'm a pet you're taking care of." He grabbed his keys. "I need space. I'm going for a drive." He disappeared for 2 days. Barbara called and texted desperately, each message going unanswered. She couldn't eat, couldn't focus at work. She imagined him leaving, packing his few belongings, disappearing from her life as suddenly as he'd entered it. The thought was unbearable. When he finally came back, he was apologetic, tender, explaining he'd just needed to clear his head. Barbara held him tightly, relief flooding through her. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'll do better. We'll combine the accounts." She set up the joint account the next week, transferring half her checking balance as a show of trust. Marcus smiled, kissed her, told her this was the beginning of their real partnership. Within a month, the account was nearly empty. When Barbara checked the transactions, there were charges she didn't recognize, cash withdrawals, online purchases, restaurant bills for amounts they'd never spent together. She confronted him carefully, trying to keep accusation out of her voice. "Marcus, I'm seeing some charges I don't understand." His face darkened instantly. We go." "I knew you couldn't actually trust me. You set me up just to throw it in my face." "No, you just what? Barbara, want to control everything? Want to make me feel like garbage because I'm not some banking VP with decades of savings? You know what your problem is. You can't let anyone in. That's why Richa left. That's why your kids never visit." The words were a slap. Barbara felt tears spring to her eyes. "That's not I'm done." Marcus stood abruptly. "I can't live like this. I'm leaving." "Wait." Barbara grabbed his arm, terror flooding her. "Please don't go. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have questioned you." He let her beg, let her cry. Finally, he agreed to stay, but only if she proved she trusted him. She transferred more money, signed a credit card over to him, stopped asking questions. The condo that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a cage. By October, 1 year since that first coffee, Barbara barely recognized her life. The cheerful notes by the coffee pot had stopped months ago. Marcus rarely left the condo now, spending his days on the couch, scrolling his phone, ordering takeout with her credit cards. When Barbara came home from work, exhausted and increasingly anxious about finances, he'd criticize her. She was late. She was distant. She didn't appreciate what he did around the house. She couldn't remember the last time he'd actually cleaned or cooked. Her savings account was empty. Her retirement fund, carefully built over 30 years, had been diminished by early withdrawals. Marcus had convinced her to make 4 investments that never materialized. She'd taken out a second mortgage on the condo she'd worked so hard to own outright. Marcus had insisted they needed capital for a business opportunity. The opportunity had evaporated. The debt remained. At work, Barbara's performance was slipping. She'd been late to meetings, missed deadlines, snapped at colleagues. Her boss, Sharon, had called her into the office in early November with concerned eyes. "Barbara, I need to ask if everything's okay at home. Everything's fine, Barbara lied, forcing a smile. You know you can talk to me. Sharon's voice was gentle. And I need you to know the board has concerns about some financial irregularities. Barbara's blood ran cold. What do you mean? There's been unusual account activity. Small transfers. Nothing major, but it's raised flags. The auditors want to schedule a meeting. Barbara felt the room spin. She knew what Sharon was implying. She also knew she had nothing to hide professionally, but the shame of her personal financial disaster made her defensive. I've been with this bank for 28 years. My record is spotless. I know. And I'm in your corner. Just be prepared for questions. That night, Barbara tried to talk to Marcus about getting a job, any job. They needed income. She was drowning. He responded by accusing her of being ashamed of him, of caring more about money than their relationship. The argument escalated until he punched a hole in the drywall near the bedroom door. Barbara stood frozen, staring at the damage. Marcus immediately began crying, apologizing, saying he didn't know what came over him, blaming stress and his PTSD from the army. He held her tightly while she trembled. I'd never hurt you, he whispered. You know that, right? I'd never hurt you. Barbara didn't answer. For the first time, she felt genuinely afraid. She began hiding money, small amounts skimmed from cash transactions, stored in an envelope taped behind a drawer in her desk at work. She told no one about Marcus's outburst. When Linda from book club asked how things were going, Barbara painted a rosy picture. When Connor called and mentioned he'd tried to reach her several times, Barbara blamed being busy at work. She couldn't let anyone see how far she'd fallen. In December, the bank's audit uncovered nothing improper in her work accounts, but the investigation had damaged her reputation. Colleagues who'd respected her for decades now whispered when she walked by. Barbara knew what they were saying, that she'd become distracted, unreliable, that maybe it was time for her to consider early retirement. She'd given 30 years to that building. Now it felt like a trap. At home, Marcus had started disappearing for hours without explanation. He'd return with vague stories about meeting old army buddies or checking on job leads. His phone, once casually left on the counter, was now password protected and constantly by his side. Barbara found a dating app notification on their shared iPad one afternoon, a message to someone named Ashley92 that started with "Hey beautiful." When she confronted him, Marcus didn't deny it. He simply shrugged. We're barely together anymore. Barbara, you're always at work. You're stressed all the time. I have needs. I'm stressed because of you, Barbara shouted, something inside her finally cracking. Because of what you've done to my life. What I've done? His voice was ice. I've been nothing but supportive. You're the one who can't handle a real partnership. You're the one who's controlling and cold, and get out. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere Barbara had almost forgotten existed. Get out of my house. Marcus's expression shifted from anger to surprise to calculation. You don't mean that. Get out. He studied her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a sound without warmth. Fine, but you owe me. I owe you. For emotional damages. For a year of my life. For the promises you made. He pulled out his phone, started typing. My lawyer will be in touch. Your lawyer? Barbara felt hysterical laughter bubbling up. You don't have a lawyer. You don't have anything. Wrong. I have documentation of every cent you gave me. Every promise you made. Every time you said we were building a life together. In North Carolina, that's worth something. Common law, baby. Hope that VP salary can cover it. He walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Barbara sank to the floor, her back against the couch, and sobbed until she had nothing left. The next morning, she found he'd cleared out the joint account every remaining penny. Her credit cards were maxed out. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from her bank's fraud department. Barbara Michelle, who'd built everything she had through discipline and hard work, was left with almost nothing. The condo had a second mortgage. Her savings were gone. Her retirement fund was a fraction of what it had been. Her reputation at work was in tatters. Her family was distant. Her friends had stopped calling. She was 58 years old, and she'd let a stranger dismantle her entire life. The first thing Barbara did was change the locks. The second was cry for 3 days straight, calling in sick to work for the first time in a decade. The third was force herself to look at the full extent of the damage. The numbers made her physically ill. Between the money she'd given Marcus, the second mortgage, the maxed credit cards, and the early retirement withdrawals with penalties, she'd lost nearly $200,000. Her credit score had plummeted. She'd have to work until she was 70, now maybe longer. The condo she'd been so proud of might have to be sold just to dig herself out of debt. On the fourth day, Barbara dragged herself out of bed, showered for the first time since Marcus left, and forced herself to make a list. She'd spent 30 years in banking. She understood debt, restructuring, recovery. She could treat her own life like a failing portfolio that needed rehabilitation. But first, she had to tell someone. The shame was suffocating. The urge to hide so strong she could barely breathe against it. But she couldn't do this alone. She called Maya. Her daughter listened in silence as Barbara explained everything: the loneliness that had made her vulnerable, the slow escalation, the financial devastation, the year she'd lost. When Barbara finished, her voice hoarse from crying, there was a long pause. "Mom," Maya said finally, her voice thick with emotion, "why didn't you tell me? I was embarrassed. I thought I could handle it. I thought," Barbara's voice broke, "I thought if I admitted it out loud, it would make it real." "It's already real. But you're not alone. Connor and I were coming to Charlotte this weekend. Don't argue." They came, both her children, flying across the country, sitting at her kitchen island as she walked them through the financial wreckage. Connor, who worked in tech, helped her freeze her credit and set up fraud alerts. Maya researched victim assistance resources and found a lawyer who specialized in financial exploitation cases. "You need to report him," Maya said firmly. "What he did, it's not just a bad relationship. It's a crime." Barbara resisted at first. The thought of making it official, of more people knowing, was unbearable. But Maya was relentless. Together, they went to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department and filed a report. The detective, a woman in her 40s named Garcia, was kind but realistic. "These cases are hard to prove," she explained, "especially when there was a romantic relationship. But we'll investigate. And having it on record helps if he tries this with someone else." The investigation uncovered that Marcus Webb wasn't even his real name. His actual name was David Harrison, and he had a pattern at least 4 other women across 3 states, all around Barbara's age, all left financially devastated. He'd varied his story slightly each time, but the tactics were identical. Identify lonely, financially stable women, build trust quickly, move in fast. systematically drained resources while creating dependency through emotional manipulation. Barbara felt violated all over again, knowing she'd been a target, a mark. But she also felt something else. Vindication. It wasn't her fault. She hadn't been weak or stupid. She'd been targeted by someone who was skilled at exploitation. The lawyer Maya found, Catherine Reed, was straightforward. We can try to pursue civil damages, but, frankly, he's likely judgment-proof. Men like this don't keep assets in their own names. The criminal case is your best shot at any kind of justice, and even that's uncertain. Justice felt abstract. Barbara needed her life back. She started with the bank. She requested a meeting with Sharon and the board. Walking into the conference room with her head high despite the shame churning in her stomach, she laid out everything, not just what had happened at home, but how it had affected her work. She took responsibility for her lapses, while also explaining the circumstances. "I understand if you need to let me go," she said at the end, her voice steady despite her terror. "But I'm asking for a chance to rebuild." "I've given 3 decades to this institution. I'd like the opportunity to finish my career with dignity." Sharon exchanged glances with the board members. "Take a month off," she said finally. "Paid leave. Get your life in order. We'll have a position for you when you come back." It wasn't her VP role that ship had sailed, but it was a lifeline. Barbara used the month to take back control. She met with a financial advisor who helped her create a recovery plan. It would take 5 years to dig out of the debt if she was disciplined. The condo might still have to go, but there were options. She could downsize, eliminate the second mortgage, and start rebuilding. She also started therapy. The therapist, Dr. Patricia Guang, helped Barbara see the patterns she'd missed in real time. How Marcus had isolated her, made her question her own judgment, created a cycle of crisis and rescue that kept her off balance. "You weren't foolish, Doctor," Huang said during one session. "You were human. Loneliness is a profound vulnerability." He exploited that. Barbara also joined a support group for victims of financial exploitation, sitting in a church basement in Plaza Midwood with 8 other people who'd been through similar experiences. She felt truly seen for the first time in months. These weren't weak people. They were a retired teacher, a nurse, a small business owner, a veteran. All smart, all capable, all human. One woman, Denise, became a particular friend. She'd lost her home to a scammer who'd posed as a contractor. "The shame's the worst part," Denise said over coffee after a meeting. "Worse than the money. The shame of admitting you fell for it." "How do you get past it?" Barbara asked. "You don't. You learn to carry it differently, and you help the next person so they don't carry it alone." By spring, Barbara had made measurable progress. She'd moved into a smaller apartment in noted just 2 bedrooms, but affordable on her reduced salary. She'd consolidated her debts and was making steady payments. She'd reconnected with her kids, visiting Seattle for 2 weeks and meeting her grandchildren properly for the first time. She'd even started attending book club again, ignoring the pitying looks and focusing on the stories instead. Marcus David, whatever his name was arrested in Tennessee that March. Caught mid-scam with a 62-year-old widow in Nashville. The charges were fraud, identity theft, and exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The trial was set for summer. Barbara wasn't sure if she'd testify, but knowing he was locked up, that he couldn't hurt anyone else for now, brought a measure of peace. The hardest part wasn't the money, it was learning to trust herself again. 2 years after Marcus walked out, Barbara stood in the small garden plot she'd rented in the Noda Community Gardens, her hands in the soil, planting tomatoes in the late April warmth. Her apartment was tiny compared to the condo, but it was hers. No second mortgage, no ghosts in the corners, no fear about who might walk through the door. The financial recovery had taken longer than projected. The condo had sold, finally, allowing her to eliminate most of the debt. She'd be working until 65 at least, maybe longer, but she'd made peace with that. Her retirement wouldn't be lavish, but it would be enough. She'd learned the difference between enough and everything. Work had stabilized into something manageable. She wasn't a VP anymore, but she was respected in her role as a senior loan officer. She helped clients navigate financial decisions, and sometimes, when she sensed something of a spouse pushing too hard for joint accounts, someone explaining away red flags, she'd gently ask questions. She'd helped 3 women recognize warning signs before they'd gotten as deep as she had. That felt like its own kind of redemption. Her relationship with her kids had deepened. Connor and Maya called frequently now, not just Sunday obligation calls, but real conversations. They visited Charlotte regularly. Barbara had stopped pretending to be fine and started being honest about struggling, and somehow, that had made the distance between them shrink. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Maya had said during her last visit, watching Barbara cook dinner in the tiny apartment kitchen, "for rebuilding, for getting help, for not giving up." Barbara had cried then. The good kind of tears. The trial had been brutal. Barbara had decided to testify, standing in that Nashville courtroom and walking through the years she'd lost. David Harrison had smirked from the defense table, and Barbara had wanted to scream at him. Instead, she'd kept her voice level, her facts straight, her dignity intact. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 8 years. It wouldn't give her back the time or money, but it removed him from the world where he could hurt others. That was something. The support group had become a cornerstone of Barbara's life. She'd taken on a co-facilitator role, helping newer members navigate the overwhelming shame and confusion. Denise was still her closest friend from the group, and they met for coffee weekly, talking about everything from recovery strategies to book recommendations to dating horror stories. "Are you going to try again?" Denise had asked recently. Meeting someone, Barbara had considered it. She wasn't the same person who'd downloaded that app in her lonely condo. She'd learned about red flags, about moving slowly, about maintaining boundaries. She'd learned that loneliness was painful but survivable, and that being with the wrong person was far worse than being alone. "Maybe," she'd said, "but I'm okay if I don't. I'm not empty anymore." And she wasn't. The loneliness that had pressed against her chest for years had transformed into something else. Solitude she'd chosen. Space, she'd claimed. Her small apartment felt like a sanctuary, not a prison. Her Saturday mornings were for the garden, for book club, for volunteering at the women's shelter where she taught financial literacy classes. Her evenings were for cooking simple meals, reading on her tiny balcony, FaceTiming with her grandchildren. She'd joined a book club specifically for women over 50. She'd reconnected with Linda, who'd welcomed her back without judgment. She'd even started dating Betty Kazwadi, a retired architect she'd met at a community event, who understood when she said she needed to take things slowly. They'd had 4 dates in 3 months. There was no pressure to escalate, no expectation of more than she was ready to give. Barbara had learned to recognize the difference between connection and dependence. Between love and exploitation, between being vulnerable and being a victim. On her 59th birthday, her kids surprised her by flying in together. They'd arranged a small party in her apartment, just them. Denise, Linda, a few friends from work and the support group. Connor brought barbecue from his favorite Charlotte spot. Maya brought a cake with exactly 59 candles. Make a wish, Mom, Maya said. Barbara looked around the small living room at the faces of people who'd stood by her through the worst of it. She thought about the woman she'd been 2 years ago, desperate and broken and convinced she'd lost everything. I don't need to, Barbara said, smiling. I already have what I need. Later, after everyone had left and the apartment was quiet, Barbara sat on her balcony with a glass of wine, watching Charlotte's lights twinkle in the distance. Her phone buzzed, a notification from the dating app she'd reluctantly re-downloaded at Denise's encouragement. Say open edit, ready to delete another generic message. Instead, it was from a man named Robert, 61, a teacher, 2 adult sons. His message was thoughtful, referencing a book she'd mentioned in her profile, asking a genuine question rather than offering a compliment. Barbara smiled, then closed the app without responding. Not yet. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe next week. Maybe never. For the first time in years, she had the luxury of choice. She'd learned that being alone wasn't the same as being abandoned. That starting over didn't mean starting from nothing. That the foundation she'd thought Marcus destroyed had actually been inside her all along, just buried under fear and shame and desperation. Barbara had lost almost everything she'd built. But in the ruble, she'd discovered something more valuable, the ability to build again, this time on solid ground she'd laid herself. The condo was gone. The savings were depleted. The career had taken a hit. But Barbara Mischel, divorced, 59, scarred but standing, had gotten the most important thing back. She'd gotten herself back. And this time she was keeping the keys.